In the 1970s, as a response to the growing trend for domestic air travel and private motoring, British Rail attempted to win back passengers with an audacious new high-speed express unit, the Advanced Passenger Train, or APT, a tilting train that was capable of 160 miles an hour and presented many endearing qualities. The APT would be the first train in the world to integrate an active tilting mechanism that would be used to overcome the many winding main lines of the UK rail network, but after 15 years of trial and error, the project would go from being the bold future of British train travel to the laughingstock of the industry, falling just short of its goal when the government chose to axe the entire scheme. The APT owes its existence entirely to the failure of the 1955 modernisation plan, a scheme that hoped to address the endemic problems with the infrastructure of Britain's railways, most notably the bends of primary trunk routes between the nation's regional centres, with the West Coast Main Line that runs from London Euston to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow being a prime example. This route is noted for its meandering course along valley floors and around hills, especially north of Preston, where the line is forced into the Lune Gorge of Cumbria and over Beattock Summit in southern Scotland, presenting a formidable obstacle for the running of fast trains between London and Glasgow. These existing problems would be exacerbated further by the arrival of domestic airliners and the introduction of the motorway network during the 1950s and 60s, meaning that faster, long and short-distance journeys could be undertaken by modes which were perceived to be more convenient when compared to train travel. Britain's first moves to accelerate train services began in 1962, when Dr. Sidney Jones of the RAF Weapons Department at Farnborough was hired by British Rail to investigate a number of infrastructure-related derailments in the late 1950s and early 1960s, determining that the problem was largely caused by hunting oscillation, a self-oscillation of train wheels between the rails that, if unchecked, would lead to derailments. This was largely caused by a mixture of high-speed operations and poor-quality track work, with Jones hiring Alan Wickens of Armstrong Whitworth to help determine a solution, and through the use of an incomplete paper penned in 1930 by railway dynamics expert F.W. Carter, Wickens soon discovered that the problem was caused by dynamic instability, and began work in 1964 on the high-speed freight vehicle, or HSFB-1. This scheme would take a contemporary freight wagon and test it with a modified wheel design that excluded conventional bogies, and could therefore reach 140 miles an hour without suffering from hunting oscillation. And from the information gathered during the HSFB-1 research, the British Rail Board chose to develop the concept further into a high-speed passenger train. The biggest concern of the project, though, was the aforementioned winding nature of Britain's railways. While limited government subsidies meant that little to no investment existed, the large-scale infrastructural alternatives, including the ironing out of tight corners, or the creation of a bespoke high-speed line such as the recently opened Tokaido Shinkansen of Japan, with this route being the first dedicated high-speed railway, and one that brought the cities of Tokyo and Shin Osaka to within 2 hours of each other as opposed to the previous 6. While the use of superelevation or canting was proposed, wherein the running lines were tilted in order to push the centrifugal force down towards the carriage floor, this could only be limited up to 6.5 degrees on a mixed traffic main line. As while it would be increasingly effective for high-speed services, slow-moving passenger trains and freight services would not be able to travel fast enough to counter the gravitational forces of the tilt, causing passengers and cargo to tip or fall in the direction of gravity. Therefore, a tilting train was proposed instead, whereby the carriages of the train itself would bend into corners, this concept being pioneered in the United States by the Pacific Railway Equipment Company, when aviation designer William E. Van Dorn of the California Institute of Technology, in conjunction with Northrop aircraft engineers Elliot F. Stoner and Herbert J. Whedon, developed the first pendulum cars in 1937. The pendulum cars utilized a specially designed coil spring system in the bogies that placed the car body and the passengers above the center of gravity, thus resulting in the car tilting as it entered curves. But while the prototype pendulum cars were used briefly by the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy, and the Great Northern Railway, the pendulum tilt system was sadly not followed up, due largely to the influence of World War II and the expense of the design. In 1956, the pendulum design was once again revived by SNCF of France with slight modifications to the previously used American system. But by this stage, pendulum tilting systems were being superseded by passive tilt systems developed by Renfe of Spain, with the Tren Articulado Ligero Geochecha Oriol or Talgo pendula. The Talgo system was based on a large A-frame connected to the center of the bogie that was as high as the car's body, at the top of which was a bearing system that swung to either side around the bearing axis, thus causing the carriages to naturally pendulum inward on curves, while dampers smoothed the motion. Following early successful tests of the Talgo method in Spain, the system was trialled in the United States by the New Haven Railroad between 1957 and 1958, and later by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway between 1960 and 1966, culminating in the United Aircraft Corporation turbo-train gas turbine-powered articulated multiple units of 1968, the world's first commercial tilting trains. However, the UAC turbo train was not a major success, especially with regard to the tilting mechanism, as the carriage could easily be knocked off balance at low speed, resulting in it swinging and swaying in a distressing manner, while due to the system being passive and relying on bearings and weights, tilting into corners was usually delayed. British Rail would thus decide that an active system controlled by hydraulics would be better, this being developed with the assistance of Dutch engineer A.J. Ishbert, who was hired by Wickens in 1965 to help him create an active tilt system based on hydraulic cylinders that would drive the carriage to the proper angle and hold it there without any unwanted swinging. This would also allow for tilting movement to fit within the limited clearance of the British loading gauge, rather than swinging out much farther like the passive system. The combination of Ishbert's research with the high-speed bogie from the HSFV-1 project, resulting in the unveiling of the high-speed passenger vehicle concept in November 1966. This was presented to the British Railways Board and comprised a dummy car fitted with HSFV-1 bogies and an active tilt system capable of rotating the car at a maximum angle of 9 degrees, which could also be enhanced through the provision of superelevation to make the most of the train's cant and reduced influence of centrifugal forces. Once Wickens, with the help of BR engineers Mike Newman and Alistair Gilchrist, had developed a suitable experimental train to test the new active tilt system, the goal of the project was to deliver a high-speed train capable of 155 miles an hour and able to enter corners 40% faster than a conventional train, but the BR board were less enthused by the idea, thus forcing Wickens to appeal to the UK government directly. However, the government was even less enthusiastic than British Rail, and Wickens would spend the next 2 years attempting to appeal the case until finally, in January 1969, a joint programme between the Ministry of Transport and the British Railways Board was established, this programme being based on a 50-50 funding basis, undertaken over 16 years with an expiry date of March 1985. This therefore created two projects, the Advanced Passenger Train, or APT, and the Train Control Project, an advanced signalling and train control system that would be introduced to support the APT and higher-speed train operations. Eventually, in May 1969, a prototype APT set, consisting of an articulated 4-car unit with 2 power cars and 2 intermediate trailers, was approved for construction as a proof of concept used for performance monitoring and analysis, while conventional diesel-electric engines were supplanted with gas turbine equivalents to reduce the load. Initial considerations were for Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop engines from the Vickers Viscount to be used, before settling instead on Leyland 2S 350 gas turbine power plants producing 300 horsepower, these turbines being experimental new lorry engines designed by British Leyland and capable of achieving 156 miles an hour, with the space frame body of the power cars being based on a welded steel tube design derived from Westland helicopter technology. Meanwhile, GEC and English Electric built the intermediate trailers, which incorporated a large portion of their body shells from the fuselage of the BAC-111 jet airliner, and British Rail Engineering Limited was tasked with developing the bogies, with the trailers being built alongside English Electric Lightning F6 fighters, before final assembly of the unit was undertaken at Metro Camel's factory in Washwood Heath near Birmingham. At the same time, 13.5 miles of the former Melton Mowbray to Nottingham section of the Midland Railway between London and Leeds, which had closed to through traffic in 1968 under the Beeching Acts, was repurposed for use as a test track, and is today known as the Old Dalby Test Track. It was here that a rig, which consisted of 2 converted flatbed wagons with empty space frames on them, was hauled up and down the line by a Class 17 Clayton diesel locomotive, this set being dubbed the POP or Power Zero Power, a moniker derived from the fact that the 2 intermediate trailers were not passenger carriages, with testing of the POP rig continuing until the end of 1971. After this, the new APT set emerged for the first time from the Derby Research Labs and was christened the name APT-E or Experimental, followed 6 months later, on July 25, 1972, by the set venturing out onto the mainline network for the first time, running 6 miles up the Derwent Valley to Duffield on a low-speed run. However, while the maiden journey went without flaws, the APT-E's cab design, which comprised only a single driver's seat with no second-man seat due to the presence of critical safety structures for the streamlined cab, caused consternation among members of the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, or ASLEF, the Railwaymen's Union, as it suggested that the train would bring about single-man operation across the BR network and make workers redundant. The APT-E was thereby blacked by ASLEF, and could therefore not be driven on the British mainline network by drivers related to the Union, with problems compounded further when the set was moved via the main line the short journey from the Derby Technical Labs to the nearby Etchers Park traction depot on the opposite side of the Midland Main Line, which led to ASLEF calling a national one-day rail strike in retaliation that cost substantially more than the whole APT-E project development. The train set would continue to be blacked by ASLEF for over a year until 1973, though this was somewhat fortuitous, as the POP train had illustrated a number of design flaws with the non-driven bogies, which were prone to becoming unstable at high speed, allowing for subsequent modifications to be made to the APT-E, with bogies from the driving motors repurposed for use with the unpowered trailers. The APT-E would return to the main line in August 1973, and began a series of trials on the Old Derby test track, though these ended abruptly after 8 months, when, in March 1974, the set started to exhibit serious reliability issues that required an overhaul, with the Leyland gas turbine engines being uprated from 300 to 330 horsepower, while other changes included new motor bearings. Eventually, the overhauled APT-E set returned to testing in June 1974, and was trialled on the Old Derby test track and the faster sections of the Great Western Main Line between London and Bristol, resulting in the set becoming the fastest train ever to run on Britain's railways when it attained a maximum speed of 152.3 miles an hour between Swindon and Reading on August 10, 1975. It would later set another record on October 30th of the same year, when it covered the 99-mile journey from Leicester to London St Pancras on the Midland Main Line in a mere 58 minutes and 30 seconds, averaging 101 miles an hour and illustrating a massive journey time improvement over the regular loco-hauled services on the route. Testing of the APT-E continued until May 1976, after which the set was retired immediately to the National Railway Museum in York on June 11th of the same year, having covered an impressive 23,500 miles during its 3-year service career. The main reason for withdrawing the gas turbine set was due to the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, during which the price of fuel skyrocketed, and the thirsty power plants of the unit were quickly rendered obsolete, as drives towards more sustainable power sources were made, resulting in the conversion of the APT project to electric traction when the prototype set, the APT-P, was launched in 1974. The APT-P, apart from a simple conversion from gas turbine to electric propulsion, illustrated a new series of challenges, primarily due to the positioning and number of pantographs present per train, as it was found that having 2 pantographs passing across the overhead wires at high speed within close proximity of each other caused resonant waves that damaged the infrastructure, thus resulting in a stipulation that only 1 pantograph would be raised at a time, but this led to further concerns regarding the placement of 25 kilovolt AC electric equipment within the passenger carriage. In order to alleviate this, non-passenger power cars would be placed at the centre of the set, essentially splitting the train in half, these power cars providing an overall power output of 2,600 horsepower per car, but caused logistical issues, as by splitting the train in 2, all facilities in one half set had to be duplicated for the other half set, while the maintenance passageway through the power cars was not suited for public use. Further internal problems were also noted due to the train's sole dependence on the overhead electric wires, as if there was a total power failure, the lighting and air conditioning could not be controlled, rendering conditions inside the carriage unsafe and unbearable very quickly, culminating in the fitting of a small diesel generator to power auxiliary functions in the event of a power failure. Matters of actually driving the APT, specifically the high-speed operation of the train on existing railways, meant that visual identification of speed signs would also be rendered problematic due to the speed and ability to react in time, thus requiring a new computer-controlled system called CAPT to be developed. CAPT would comprise a small transponder that was placed 1 kilometre ahead of an approaching speed restriction that would flag an alert within the cab of the train, with failure to acknowledge the audible alert causing the application of the brakes automatically. Cosmetically, the APT-P differed little from its experimental precursor, retaining the previous articulated bogie design, but with a new system installed that would cause carriages where the tilting mechanism had broken to return to the upright position, rather than being left in a helpless tilted position, while the hydraulically actuated friction brakes used for low speed were modified to be fed by a passive hydraulic intensifier rather than a hydraulic power pack. In total, the APT-P project would consist of 8 train sets, of which 80% of the cost would be covered by the UK government. But while the design team attempted to reduce the proposed 155-mile-an-hour top speed in order to simplify the design, British Rail were determined to have a train that could easily outdo both domestic air travel and private motoring. This was set against the backdrop of concerns being raised that the BR Development and Research Department were investing too much of their time into the APT project, thus causing other proposals to improve the network to be abandoned or put on hold. In the end, BR were convinced to greenlight another project that would carry over the passenger sector until the full-scale introduction of the APT, this being the non-tilting 125-mile-an-hour high-speed train, or HST, a diesel-powered express train that would eventually enter service in 1976. However, while the HST became a cultural icon that almost single-handedly saved train travel in Britain, its introduction came at the expense of rendering the original 8 APT sets to 4, and later 3 following a 1974 government budget review, the result being that, by 1975, the APT project was making very slow progress, and it wouldn't be until June 1977 that the first APT-P power car was delivered from BR's Derby Works. This coach would undergo early testing on the West Coast Main Line behind the former prototype HST power cars, followed a year later by the first passenger vehicles, and, in May 1979, the first full train of 2 half-sets designated the Class 370. Testing of the Class 370 began in the summer of 1979, and in December of the same year, it had already broken the speed record for fastest train in Britain at 162.2 miles an hour, a record it would continue to maintain until July 2003, when a Class 373 Eurostar set, operating on the partially opened high-speed 1, would reach 208 miles an hour. This was followed by the arrival of the 2 other APT sets in December 1979 and the spring of 1980, each of which had noted minor differences, the arrival of the APT being a highly publicized affair, with a complete set making an appearance at the Rocket 150 event in May 1980, the 150th anniversary of the original Rainhill trials that tested the abilities of the first British steam locomotive designs. For the event, the APT was propelled past cheering crowds by a Class 56 diesel locomotive, while also introducing to the public the iconic red, white and graphite grey intercity livery, a stark contrast to the now rather careworn BR corporate blue and grey of the 1960s. What the public wasn't aware of was how delayed the brave new face of Britain's railways actually was, a problem that caused further complications upon the start of testing, specifically issues with the brake units that had been in storage since 1976. These brake cylinders, which had been hastily converted from an oil-based system to a water glycol-based system, being especially deteriorated due to the anti-corrosion coating having broken down. This meant that even at low speeds, the APT sets would struggle to stop within acceptable parameters, while the compressed air system that operated the brakes and powered doors were also prone to condensation freezing due to the torturous testing regimen of the train sets. Perhaps the most glaring problem with the APT-P was the clearance of the tilting trains themselves, with the potential existing for APT sets at full inward tilt to strike one another due to the narrow loading gauge of the BR network, presenting a potentially deadly flaw in the APT's overall design and operation that could not be easily addressed. The final major problem the APT faced during early tests was from the BR management itself, when during a series of cuts in the run-up to sectorization in 1982, the APT development team was disbanded, while BR was still contractually obliged to pursue the APT project until March 1985, thereby ensuring that train testing could continue. However, responsibility for the development of newer train designs would be left in the hands of several BR departments, leading, by the end of 1980, to the initial enthusiasm for the train's unveiling quickly dissipating, and the APT was left to face the stringent pressures of the ever-critical national press, with a private eye report published in late 1981 highlighting the disastrous development and phenomenal delays the project had incurred thanks to a leak from within the design team. This terrible public relations blow called BR's hand, and, despite the ongoing faults with the tilting mechanism and other elements of the train's technology, the management demanded that the APT-P be put into revenue-earning service immediately. The date was December 7, 1981, and after being hastily prepared by the maintenance crews at Polmadie Depot south of Glasgow, a Class 370 rolled into Glasgow Central Station to whisk invited members of the press on a 4-hour and 15-minute journey to London Euston, being able to shave 45 minutes off the journey time. Tragically, in one of the most infamous days in British railway history, the APT's image was tarnished irreparably when Private Eye released its next issue, placing less emphasis on the train's improvement in speed and more on the sensation of seasickness felt due to the active tilt system, epitomised by the now iconic Queasy Rider headline. British Rail would respond by saying the sensation of motion sickness experienced by the press officials was more due to their liberal consumption of alcohol the previous night rather than the train, though it was later discovered through various leaks that the BR design team were fully aware of the motion sickness induced by the tilting mechanism. However, due to the APT being rushed into public service, they could do little to rectify this fault, the problem being due largely to the delay in the control system to respond to a curve, with the train reacting rapidly after a 2 to 3 second lag, and therefore giving the impression that it was about to capsize. 2 days later, during one of the worst winters in British history, the APT-P attempted to make its return run from London to Glasgow, but not long after departure from the capital, the tilt mechanism in one of the coaches failed and was left in a lopsided position, resulting in the set being cancelled at crew and leaving the reporters and journalists in the snow. Very soon, the APT had become the harbinger of everything that was wrong with British Rail, with every failure, breakdown or mishap being extensively reported, exacerbated by leaks from within the design team, that noted that only 2 of the 3 sets were actually operational, with the third being out of service for a prolonged period due to ongoing problems, resulting in the APT being branded the accident-prone train. Further leaks reported that confidence by the BR management in the train's reliability was so poor that a relief train, comprised of a conventional locomotive and stock, would shadow the APT around 15 minutes behind it in the event of a failure, while the proposed 155-mile-an-hour top speed was also unobtainable due to the set having to share the main line with slower freight and passenger trains, forcing it to an operational maximum speed of 125 miles an hour. Thankfully, despite the bombardment of criticism, things weren't entirely bleak for the project, as following a report published by the consultancy firm Ford and Dane Partners, it was found that, on a technical level, the APT was mechanically sound, with the only issue being due to the untrustworthy brake mechanisms and the management structure of the project overall. As for solutions to the motion sickness problem, these could be made by slightly reducing the amount of tilt to be deliberately less than needed, which resulted in a small amount of leftover centrifugal force, though this came at the expense of any perceived improvements from the tilting train proposal. Between 1981 and 1984, development and amendments to the APT project quietly continued, while further variants of the train were established, including the APT-S or squadron sets, which would comprise of between 8 and 10 coaches either sandwiched between 2 power cars or between 1 power car and a driving van trailer cab car. This was combined with an APT set suited for use through the proposed Channel Tunnel, a set that was third rail compatible for the southern region, and a possible diesel-powered APT that could supplement the HSTs, while within the wider project itself, Class 370s were gradually reintroduced into passenger service throughout the summer of 1984, and were inserted into the schedule on diagrams usually reserved for loco-hauled trains. This meant that passengers were largely unaware they'd be riding on one of the new tilting trains until it arrived at the station, with responses to the APT this time being a touch more positive, thanks largely to the motion sickness problem having been alleviated. But again, due to the train being unable to tilt to its maximum design capability, these sets were limited to only 125 miles an hour, negating their potential speed advantage. The biggest problem, however, was that the mud had stuck to the APT politically, with the anti-rail government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher seeing the train as nothing more than a needless waste of state funding, while also noting the incredible success of the HST in delivering fast, modern and efficient train travel to the masses. These factors combined ultimately saw the APT project gradually dismantled in the run-up to the end of its 15-year contractual deadline in March 1985, with the APT-S and other variants being dropped, and the Class 370 sets themselves being withdrawn and placed into storage in the winter of 1985, although it is known that half sets 370-001 and 002 were still undergoing tests as late as April 1986. Of the Class 370 units, the first set, comprising half sets 370-001 and 002, were stored at Polmady Depot in southern Glasgow, but continued to see work operating extra-capacity trains in a short rake formation from Glasgow Central Station to Anderston in order to transport journalists and attendees to the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre. Meanwhile, 370-003 and 006 were initially stored at Crewe Electric Depot, but were eventually sold in 1988 by BR to famous DJ, entrepreneur and railway enthusiast Pete Waterman in order to hide it from the condemning eyes of the public at a remote siding adjacent to the Crewe Heritage Centre, which had opened in July 1987. The last set, 370-004 and 005, after being stored at Wolverton near Milton Keynes, ended up at Glasgow Shields Road TMD south of the Clyde, where it was stripped for spares before it and 370-001 and 002 were broken up at CF Booth Scrapyard in Rotherham and Finkberry Limited Scrapyard in Leicester, respectively. For the surviving half sets, 370-003 and 006, This complete train set comprises 6 coaches and has been fully restored inside and out so as to provide an internal display for the APT project, as well as giving a glimpse to the passenger accommodation of the train set, with the tilting mechanism having also been remotely activated on a number of occasions. Furthermore, one of the 2 surviving power cars, which wasn't able to fit within the limited space of the siding along with the rest of the Class 370, was moved from museum to museum over the course of 30 years, before eventually ending up back with the rest of the set in Crewe in October 2017, where it has been cosmetically restored but doesn't form part of the preserved train set. As for the legacy of the APT, while it has been considered one of the biggest failures in British railway history, the technology behind the concept was sound, as demonstrated when Fiat Ferroviaria, who had been developing their own tilting train in parallel to the APT since the mid-1970s for Italy's winding railway network, released the ETR 450 in 1988, though this had very little in common with the British APT on a technological level. These train sets adopted a gyroscopic tilting mechanism rather than the accelerometer-based system used by the British, with the Italian system being able to readily detect the change in horizon caused by the start of the parabolic connection that precedes entry into curves, resulting in a smooth tilt into and out of corners that is barely noticeable. The ETR 450 revolutionized express operations on the Italian railway network, and soon gave rise to a family of highly successful tilting trains known as the pendolino or pendulum. This range of multiple units having been developed and improved over the following decades, with new members being introduced even to this day, and sold to nations including the Czech Republic, Poland, China, Switzerland, Russia, Finland, Germany and more. In 2002, tilting train technology came back to Britain in the form of the initial 52 Class 390 pendolino sets, which were introduced by Virgin Trains to replace loco-hauled stock on the West Coast Main Line between London Euston, Glasgow, Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, which, together with a £10 billion upgrade to the infrastructure, has seen journey times between London and northern England slashed as speeds were increased to 125 miles an hour. As for the remnants of the original APT project, this essentially lived on in the form of the Class 91s and their Intercity 225 sets used on the East Coast Main Line, the 225s taking the APT-S concept and created a scaled-down version of this technology, building a 140-mile-an-hour capable express train consisting of a locomotive, coaches and a DVT. The Intercity 225s were also designed to incorporate tilting technology if it were ever needed, as attested to by their bogie design and tapered carriage profiles, but in the event this never came to pass, while the sets themselves would never achieve their 140-mile-an-hour top speed in routine service, being curtailed to only 125 miles an hour as per the APTs that preceded them. Overall, it's hard to comprehend how close the advanced passenger train was to success by the time the project was cancelled in 1986, the operational sets being mechanically sound, but only requiring a few further modifications to the tilting mechanism and the brakes, creating a system that could have not only perfected the tilting train formula for Britain's railways, but also could have formed the basis of export models that may have been the modern-day equivalent to the Pendolino family. Instead, poor decisions and management, combined with an anti-rail government, meant that the APT was doomed to failure, and British rail companies would instead be buying back the tilting train technology from foreign builders, while the only remains of the UK's own endeavours now reside quietly as museum pieces, an example of what should have been a triumph instead being a calamitous defeat.